who live in isolation in the woodland, and the daughter is sort of approaching 16 years old and has never been anywhere or lived anywhere or experienced anything outside of the perimeter of this forest. And the book sort of, throughout the book we see like her developing her autonomy, but also the entrance into that space of a presence, human presence that is unknown to her, a stranger.
That is so beautifully described.
Thank you.
Could you also give us a wee reading? I think
Yes.
You were going to read the opening of Daughter's first chapter.
Yeah, it's written as a dual narrative, so it moves between the mother's narrative, which is more fragmented, third person, past tense, a bit more distanced, and the daughter's narrative, which is right up close, quite claustrophobic, and she sort of has her own language and her own words. So I'm going to read from her opening. Myma calls me daughter, but that is not always my name. What are you now, daughter? She asks. And I tell her, I am stone, or vole, or twig, or finger, or worm. She laughs at my names and calls me little stone, little sniffler daughter, crawlykin, wriggle on the belly daughter, branchling, finger daughter. Now I am mud, the clotting that rain makes of dirt. I carry it with me as I tread the forest, a bottle of wet earth tucked into the pouch slung across my bare chest. I think I will be mud for a while before the feel of the name turns dry and gritty in my mouth and I have to spit it out. Then the bottle of mud will go into the museum with all the other names I have carried. In my 15 season cycles, I have been many names, but Myma is always just Myma. I asked her once if she used to have other names too, and her eyes sort of emptied. Then she pinched the skin of her neck and twisted, so I knew not to talk of it again. Late summer air cooling now about me, nipples hardening on my chest like the drops of resin on the pine trunks. Sweat dries in the furry unders of my arms. My pouch hits against my ribs. The sack hangs empty at my side. This, my last chore before dark come, to check the traps and bring the food. As I step between the trees, I am thinking of Myma, of how she was strange this light come. How I woke at the just arrived of the light and the gone of Myma beside me, the door to the house open and bumping in the warm breeze. How I called and heard her just outside, speaking low and not to me. She often talks to herself, so that wasn't the strange part. Not strange even that she came inside with a sliced palm because she said the blood was needed for strengthening the keepsafes. The thing that bent me funny was the sore red colour around her eyes. The puff of her lids as if she'd been crying, the way I used to when I was a small daughter, but not so much now. Yet in this I cannot find sense, because Myma does not cry. Swipe my knife at a nettle and send the difficult thoughts flopping to the ground with its head. A leaf catches me on the wrist and raises a pink tingle. 9 pairs of traps in the forest, each pair marked by Myma's piles of stones balanced one on top of the other on low stumps. Back when my fingers were short and clumsy, I would try to make my own stone piles, but could never stack more than 3 before they toppled. Myma would crouch beside me to pick up the fallen stones, and I would watch with jealous, twitching fingers as the pile heaped up under her careful hands. I no longer need the stone markers to find the traps, but always the sight of them is firming, a press of Myma's hand at the base of my back. The light will not stick in the sky much longer. Soon dark will come and peel it away. I move quick along the trail our feet have trod so often that the undergrowth is worn thin, a sleeve raised through at the elbow by a bending arm. Our trudge-beaten path, spiraling out from the house and around between the trees until it meets the fence, where walking must stop.
That was beautiful. Thank you so much. It's so wonderful to hear you speaking daughter and get the rhythm of her words and her language, because that's one of the most beautiful aspects of the book.
Yeah, I read it out loud while I was writing it, so I feel like it exists in those cadences in my head.
And I think that section introduces us to so many of the main themes and ideas and the style of the book so wonderfully, and particularly the intimate connection that daughter and Myma have with nature and the cycle of the seasons, and they rely entirely on the land to survive.
Yes.
Do you have to kind of research how someone would be able to do that, or was that something you had knowledge about already?
Yeah, I did have to do research. My Google history is like really wild. I'm sure I'm on some list for typing in, how to kill a rabbit, how to skin a rabbit. And I think that, I think there was definitely an element of that. And I also wrote quite a lot of it during lockdown when I was staying with my family in Suffolk. And I was we all tried to just spend as much time as we were allowed outside during lockdown. So I think I was wandering in woodlands and feeling very daughtery while I was doing that. And I think that, what you're saying about their sort of connection with their setting, and the setting almost becomes a kind of character in that way. And I think that, I think that nature aspect was interesting to me to explore, particularly in a kind of feminist context, because there are quite a lot of narratives or tropes that involve woman enters nature and therefore woman is free. And I really wanted it to not be like that. It's very much not a utopia. It's a space of refuge, but it's also, in practical terms, quite a harsh place to live. And I wanted it to feel like very much a real forest in which they live. It's not full of helpful animals, and it's not kind to them. They exist kind of within this ecosystem and this food chain in the way that the other animals have to.
We really see that, like, the beauty of where they live, but the brutality of it as well throughout the whole novel. And like you said, it is a refuge and escape for them, but it's also very limiting. Myma has created this kind of perimeter, and she's also kind of developed her own belief system, her own culture around that perimeter. Can you talk to us about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think the kind of belief system is really, I suppose it's the mother's way of constructing the world for her child in a way that makes sense within this limited space. So there are certain words that are just omitted from the lexicon of this place because they aren't relevant to the space in which they live. And so a lot of that came through in the language, but I think it's also just various elements of control that the mother has over the space that are then kind of enforced through the way that she controls elements of her daughter's life. And I think when I was sort of constructing that belief system, I think of them almost like a cult of two, with the mother as the sort of cult leader. And I was really thinking, I suppose, about, because they live according to like routines and rituals. They have very strict, their days have a very kind of set structure, and there's an element of safety in that, really. And I think I was thinking about like folk traditions and ways of marking time that make it kind of manageable and understandable, and certain traditions that you might return to seasonally, or particular customs, I suppose, held by a people that are also just ways of understanding and controlling the world. So I think I was thinking a lot about that when constructing this belief system that she has, and that came through in the kind of perimeter that she builds. It's I guess it's superstition, really. She's building up her own folk superstitions.
And the superstitions, as you say, are like to kind of keep them safe and keep them enclosed, and it's particularly the threat of male violence that Myma fears.
So there's definitely I think it's definitely a kind of element of projection, almost like the mother doesn't necessarily reckon with the experiences that she's had. And she doesn't reckon with that trauma very well, so she is really externalizing that by, you know, constructing this strange fence out of bones and hair and branches. She's finding her own ways to sort of shut that out and bound that and place a perimeter around her own sort of acknowledgement of what has happened.
And that works so beautifully as a metaphor for how she's coping and how she's kind of both trying to protect her daughter from potential trauma and also perhaps putting her in a position of danger as well.
Yeah, I think so. And yeah, it's because there is an element of she is protecting her daughter, but I think she is very much also she recognizes that she doesn't want the daughter to leave in lots of ways, I think, as well. So she's keeping the daughter safe, but she's also containing her. And I mean, that sort of comes through in there's something that the daughter refers to as the lessons that her mother teaches her, which is kind of her mother's like self punishment. And it didn't make sense to me that any punishment would be sort of meted out against the daughter, because there is that protection has been, that sense of protection goes so far that she doesn't want her daughter to experience any form of suffering, so the suffering is kind of inflicted in an inverse way. She inflicts the punishment on herself.
Yeah, and those are some of the whole book is full of these very visceral scenes, but daughter's fear of the punishments that Myma inflicts on herself is one of the most powerful ones. Her terror of that, and the kind of, again, this duality of like, I don't want to harm my daughter, but she is harming her.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that was a balance that I was trying to strike throughout the book, really, because in lots of, I hope when people read it, they do think that in lots of ways she's a good mother, and I hope that people sympathize with her, because she is difficult, but I think I understand why she does the things she does, and I think they are at times misguided and manipulative, and she probably should go to therapy. But there is a very pure want to keep her daughter safe at the heart of them. I think that in trying to balance that, what I was trying to do was make sure that there is this sense of refuge, and there is a sense of like real joy, and like the daughter is really happy in many ways, but their existence is still really tainted by the shadow of this trauma that is coming through perhaps in just more sort of oblique ways than it doesn't happen directly, I suppose.
Sure. And I think one of the things that come across about my mama strongly is her strength. Like she's such a strong character, and she's such a initially this almost quite distant presence that you then come to know through the alternating chapters, and I loved her. And you mentioned this, this kind of threat of violence and her kind of trauma. You've talked about in an interview that you wanted to explore masculinity and this idea of like the incitement to violence. Can you talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah, I think, well, there were earlier drafts of this book that were much more angry about the male characters. And I think I came back to it, and I just wanted there to be a bit more nuance, and to think about why those incitements to violence exist, and what it is, like what's underneath what we call toxic masculinity is a term that we can probably do away with, but I think I was trying to get inside the sort of community in which the mother has grown up in, and the sort of societal pressures that exist within that community. It's like a very small insular agricultural community, and I think having that focus on that small community allowed me to create this like microcosm of society, and examine the ways in which male violence is sort of perpetuated in that space.
Yeah, and we see that really viscerally, especially with the opening of the novel itself. Opens with the aftermath of a horrific violence that has been visited on Maya. How did you approach depicting violence?
Yeah, I found it really hard to approach, and I think sexual violence particularly is really difficult to write, and I think it's difficult to write well, and not to feel like you are being gratuitous or, placing an undue focus on sort of the details of that. And my way into it was the book opens from the point of view of a fox, and I think that allowed me to have some distance from the moment, but also there's a sort of dispassionate animal view that allows the brutality of that moment to become even more palpable, I think, than if human emotions were involved in the description of that. And I think that having the fox's point of view, like this, the fox has no feelings really about what it's seeing, but the reader obviously does. So I think I was thinking about that gap between the narration and the reader's understanding of that, and how I could make the violence happen within that space.
I thought it was so poignant that the fox is pregnant as well.
Yes.
And I love your description of it. Red-brown shadow with a lugged belly full of twitching cub. The teats already swelling sore. So beautiful. And this is, we've got the pregnant fox. This is also horrifically the scene of daughter's conception.
Yeah.
Your depiction of motherhood is very bodily throughout the novel. We don't have a sanitized view of motherhood here.
No, and I think it never made sense to me to make it a sanitized view. One of the earliest scenes that I wrote was the daughter's birth, which happens in the mother's narrative. We get a flashback to that, and I think probably starting with that meant that it was obviously going to be very visceral, and that being my entry point to kind of their relationship, but also to her experience, Maya's experience of motherhood as a completely sort of bodily involved thing, and also a painful thing, and something that requires great bodily effort on her part, and really just completely happens on the level of the body. They don't speak that much to each other. They sort of just know each other intimately in ways that don't require language so much, or at least don't require language as we know it so much. So I think it was always incredibly physical, and I suppose the setting and the isolation of that, and the fact that they don't have like modern technology, and they don't have any sort of technological sort of they don't have those external like interruptions into their lives and into their relationships, so they are really just living in this quite compressed space. That means they do naturally, it's a naturally very bodily experience that they have of the world and of each other.
Yeah, and there's so much about this book that we've touched on that deals with very dark and distressing topics, but there's also this wonderful like lightness and playfulness, not necessarily to language, but I thought particularly with like the depictions of daughter being like super open about her bodily functions.
Yes.
We see at the start that she's walking bare chested. She has this kind of like burgeoning curiosity about her sexuality. It seems like it would have been quite fun to kind of explore taboos a little bit through her experience.
Yeah, and I guess there's a kind of animal quality to her in that way, but there's just a sort of naivety. I think what I was really trying to do with her character, I was thinking about the development of a consciousness at a complete remove from society and at a remove from culture, and she sort of exists outside structures of gender. I mean, she's aware that the external world is like a threat, and that anyone who comes from it is a threat, but that's not a gendered understanding for her. So she doesn't have any kind of inkling of what it would mean to be inhibited about her body. She has no reason to be, I suppose. And I think that as much as her mother has raised her, the forest and the animals in it have also raised her purely by her like observing them. And she does take real delight in her body and her bodily functions.
As should we all.
Yeah.
And you kind of touched on there, like daughters challenging of gender norms. Do you see this as like an inherent element of queer writing?
Oh yeah, maybe. I think it was. Yeah, it's interesting because I've had conversations since the book came out or since people have read it describing Daughter as a queer character, and she definitely is. But I think almost because she is so at a remove from. I mean, she wouldn't describe herself as that because she doesn't know what that means. And it's interesting as well to think about what queer even means within a space where there isn't that gender dynamic anyway. She is just so completely herself, which I think is sort of the goal of the queer project. Anyway, it's just to be oneself, and so I think that yeah, she does exist at a remove from gender, and we also see that in kind of her self-naming as well. She self-identifies. She doesn't have one specific name. She sort of fluctuates between different names. She talks about putting them on and taking them off like clothing when it no longer fits, and I think that's a really nice thing, just to be allowed. She has like an inherent fluidity, I suppose.
I'm really glad you brought up naming, because I wanted to, if you'll indulge me, just read a little part of this where she kind of lists the names that she's chosen. I have been pip, grass, acorn, catkin, stone, puddle, squirrel, birch, thistle, finger, nest, pebble, owl, moss. This list just like goes on, and there's just all these beautiful natural images that she's chosen as her name. And then she finishes with, and now I am bone, but I am also daughter. I am also myself, another thing separate to all my names, a thing that dreams and itches, a thing that even Myma, who knows everything of me, does not see completely. I love that so much. What kind of function does naming more generally play in the novel for you?
I think it's sort of because she's so incredibly tied to her mother, particularly at the beginning of the novel, and there is that realization of autonomy that sort of slowly happens. But I think her names have always been her one thing that are kind of hers, and that allow her to have a sense of self and to describe. I think they're almost a way of her describing the way that she is at that current moment and making sense of what she is. She sort of identifies with the objects that she chooses to be her sort of name objects. We see her like taking on their characteristics or reflecting their characteristics in some ways. Like when she's called Flint, describes herself as being sort of sharper and being more ready to like fight. She's a bit angrier when she's Flint, and then she's Mud, and she's a bit more, I suppose, yeah, just a bit looser when she's Mud. Yeah, I like the way that she reflects that, but I think it's a sort of identity device for her, and just a way of her making sense of herself. I think I never know how to refer to her when I'm talking about her as well, because on the blurb she's called Daughter, but that does do her a bit of a disservice because that's not really her name, and that's what her mother calls her, and I suppose there's a lack of name there really. What the name Daughter actually speaks of is a not name. It's not a name, it's a non-name, it's an absence of naming, and it's a decision not to name as well. And I think that made sense to me in their dynamic, because the act of naming it's almost like it's for somebody else. Like she would need a name in order to be referred to by someone else, but it's only her mother there, it's only those two. So she doesn't need to be referred to, she only needs to be spoken to by her mother, and her mother calls her daughter because that's what their relationship is. It's almost closer than naming. And then I did nerdy things with the names, like Maya means mother, and it also becomes Myma through the sort of slight mangling of the name that the daughter refers to her as. The third character who enters, Win, that does actually have a meaning in Old English, but I'm not going to say what it is because that would give away his function in the plot. But it makes me happy that that's what it's not mentioned that that's what it is. But I enjoy that.
It's an Easter egg for you.
Yeah.
And when he appears in the narrative, his like intrusion, he brings new language with him. He kind of initially he thinks the daughter is a boy, and he says like something like calm down, boy, or something, and she's like, what is this boy?
Yes.
I do not know this. And then he says she, and she's never even really heard the pronoun she. And I think you mentioned in an interview as well that you kind of avoided her using pronouns for herself.
Yeah. And I think I just avoided her using like she almost doesn't even refer to herself that much. She uses I sometimes, but she drops it quite a lot. It's not always a part of her sort of stream of consciousness. She'll sometimes say things like, instead of saying I pull my shorts up, she'll say pull my shorts up. And I think there's sort of two sides to that. I think one of them is that her sense of self is still sort of developing, and it's also so tied to her mother that the I pronoun gets just lost quite a lot because her I is a bit subsumed by the greater we. But I think also there's like an instructional quality to things like pull my shorts up, and that again is the influence of a mother who has instructed a child on how to do things. And I think she has her mother's voice in her head quite a lot telling her what to do, and so that's almost the way that her consciousness functions as well, as that sort of instructional directive way.
And we see this kind of quite sharp contrast between her voice in the daughter chapters, which are, as you said, they're first person, they're present tense, the chapters are like titled as well, and then when we get to Maya chapters, they're numbered third person past tense. Why did you specifically make the choice to go a little bit further from Maya?
I think it was really because I always thought of her narrative as like a narrative of gaps and fragments. I think really because that's how she thinks about her own life and her own experiences. And in my head, she does want to have a certain distance from that, and it almost felt it would have felt really wrong to narrate her from the first person, because especially in the chapters where she's describing like her childhood and growing up, she almost feels like a different person from that. There's like she's built this physical perimeter around the space in which they live, but she also has a kind of psychological barrier against that, I think, and so there's a distance from the person that she used to be in that narrative. So she was always much more sort of remote from her own narrative, whereas the daughter is like the opposite of a narrative of gaps. We experience every single thing that she experiences. She's like right up close. She narrates everything and she feels everything really intensely.
And I think we see this kind of distance with Maya as well, like with, talking about the role of language and naming in the book. Like she resists naming what happened to her and describing it, or even, she doesn't even say people or men to her daughter. She describes like the outside world as being full of rotters.
Yeah. I think it's, this sort of goes back to the question you asked at the beginning as well about the sort of belief system, and I think that it's almost not something that the mother has consciously created. She in her head, she's not deceiving or lying. This is literally how she's making sense of what has happened to her, and she's speaking about it in the only way that she can cope with it and survive with it. So I think she's managed to create a space in which those threats don't exist almost, and so she she's removed the need to even speak those words. I think especially the creating sort of the language that she would use around like people who are external to their world. She speaks about them having a kind of rottenness, and she talks about them as rotters, and they're being rot outside the fence. And so the daughter takes that very literally as like almost like there's a sort of sickness that she would acquire if she stepped beyond the perimeter of the fence. But I think really for the mother that's easier to her to create those kind of dualities of really good and evil, and to create monsters for herself rather than acknowledge that there may be a grey area and that there may be, it isn't monsters that commit things like that. It is just people, and I think that's much harder for her to live with. So she constructs them as monstrous.
And the way that she constructs them as monstrous is quite tied with nature as well. She describes it almost like there's a hole in their back that this like tree of rot grows out of.
Yeah, I took this. This is something I stole from folktale. It's in Swedish and Norwegian folklore. There are figures called huldras or hulders, and in that folklore, they're sort of sexy ladies with foxtails. And they have hollow, but then they turn around and, oh no, their backs are hollow. How awful. And it's that sort of thing that is classic in folktale of like, you shouldn't trust beauty and you also shouldn't trust ugliness. And you definitely shouldn't trust women. But with I sort of just stole that because I found the image really compelling. And it was fun to me to twist that and apply it to men instead. But yeah, it is also very tied to the space in which they live, and I suppose it's also using language that makes sense to the daughter and using language that would, I suppose, inspire a certain fear in her.
For sure. And that kind of depiction of monstrosity, is that what draws you to folktales and oral traditions more generally?
Yeah, in part. I do find it really interesting, and I mean a lot of my PhD research was around the presentation of gendered bodies in folktale, hence the kind of Huldra figures being quite present for me. And I mean, a lot of it is just how women's bodies are described in folktale, and it's usually as like monstrous or incredibly beautiful, and neither are good in folktale. But I also am really interested in, oh my God, there's a lovely bug on me.
That's
Sorry.
so appropriate.
It's really beautiful. I've never seen a bug like that. It looks a bit like poisonous as well. Oh well.
Very still.
In folktale, I'm also really interested in just the sort of tropes that exist in it, and the sort of frames of traditional storytelling. And I think that they crop up a lot in contemporary fiction, but it's interesting to me to go right to the source and see where those come from. There's an incredible, like, giant encyclopedic resource that I've used a lot for writing called the Motif Index of Folk Literature by Antti Ahn. I think he's Danish. That sounds like a Danish name. But it's basically like a huge resource of, I suppose, folktale narratives, but it will just be a description of the narrative, and they're all sort of logged in this study. And there's a few of those that felt very relevant to this. So the main one that I always think of is Child Raised in Ignorance of the World, which comes up in fairy tale quite a lot. I think the most obvious example is something like Rapunzel, sort of sequestered in the tower, raised in the tower. And I think it was interesting to me to be able to take a trope like that and then sort of actually think about the human implications for that child raised in ignorance of the world, and what kind of person that child might become, what kind of psychology is being developed there. And like, it would not be like Rapunzel, it wouldn't be this fully formed woman ready to marry. It would be she'd be such a weirdo. And I think she wouldn't, she's like daughter, she would be someone raised without society and culture and without the norms of language or social etiquette. Yeah.
Do you think that, like you say with the Rapunzel thing, or the trope more generally of child raised apart, or in ignorance of the world, is it in a very gendered way? Is it like, you know, she emerges a pure woman, untainted?
Yeah, there probably is that. That's probably what it is, isn't it? It's the virginal thing. It's always that. Yeah, I think that's probably the reason. Depressingly, there's something about being, preserved almost.
Yeah, kept apart to be. Yeah, I'm also thinking of like the maiden mother crone.
Yeah.
Kind of triptych, and we kind of have that a little bit here as well.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, there is. I should say there's a sort of shadowy fourth character, isn't there?
Yes.
I never know how to describe her without spoiling the whole book. She's
I don't want to spoil it because it's so good.
Yeah.
But like, daughter describes her mother as having two shadows in the start.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, that's all I can say, really. The mother has two shadows, and one of the shadows doesn't follow the feet.
Love that. I have just a couple more questions for Rowe, and then I will pass it over to yourselves to ask questions as well. And people joining us on the live stream, you're also welcome to ask a question, and it will be relayed to us by the wonderful Mohammed. So I also saw in an interview that you talked about how this book began as a play.
Yes.
I think it worked so well as a play. Can you talk about
I would love
why
it to be a play.
Why didn't it develop as a play? Why did you go for a novel in the end?
Well, I think I started writing it as a play, I mean, very naively, because I don't know how to do that. Though I had no precedent for writing a play. I was just like, I'm going to write a play. But it was really because I was doing my master's at the time on Samuel Beckett, and I was reading a lot of Samuel Beckett and other playwrights like Sarah Kane. And I think that this probably isn't that similar to either of their works, but they are both playwrights whose work similarly exists in like isolated spaces and at a remove from society, but at the same time is like incredibly engaged with questions about society, and also really invested in human relationships, and also deeply invested in bodies. And I think the sort of immediacy of the body in theatre was what drew me to the form, and it felt quite appropriate for what I wanted to write. But it very quickly stopped being a play when I realized I was writing really long stage directions that were just me describing stuff, and I was like, no one would see this. This is just for me. So I wanted it to be a bit more expansive in terms of how much I would be able to describe the space, but also I wanted to get inside the characters a bit more, and I felt like there was more opportunity to do that in a novel form, especially because I'd still love to see it as a play, but I think especially because their relationship is quite like, they don't speak that much, or when they do, it's in quite short sentences. It's quite functional, so it wasn't very revealing about their character. I couldn't find a way to make it sort of be as like emotionally and psychologically expansive as I wanted it to be. So it had to be a novel.
Had to be, and that gives us access to daughter's interiority, which is
which felt really like necessary, and I wanted it to be really inside her brain. And I do think that there are elements of the sort of play initial germ of that idea that have stayed. Like the bounded space really was quite functional to me in terms of the theatrical space, and also even the thing I was saying earlier around her sort of directive or instructional way of narrating herself. Those are kind of stage directions, like pull my shorts up. I think those did sort of come from stage directions, a lot of those, and I mean, it's fitting because in a way her mother is sort of her director, who is placing her and telling her what to do.
Yeah. And there's so much of it that's so visual that would work so beautifully on a stage. And you're also a visual artist. Do stories like come to you visually? Do you like see them as you're writing?
Yeah, incredibly visually. The first, I mean, I started this with like 2 images that were like so palpable, and one of those was the mother and daughter facing one another in a kind of enclosed space, and in the image I had the sort of intense eye contact and dancing in this really uninhibited, wild way that we probably wouldn't recognize as dancing, which they do in the book. And I just thought of that moment in terms of nothing else existing for them apart from each other, and that being something they're like wholly bodily engaged in, and they're so focused on this sort of strange dance that they're creating, and so then I suppose I worked out from that image, and I was like, oh, the space they're in is this hut, and the hut is in a clearing, and the clearing is in a forest, and the forest is inside the fence, and then beyond that is this unknown space. And so then the second image that I had was of the figure who enters the forest, who is a red-haired man called Win. And I think the color red was important because he is this huge interruption in the forest, and the red allowed that to be a very visual interruption as well. There's a line where the daughter talks about never having seen that particular shade of red. And so this is not a color that exists in her world, and this is not a presence that has ever existed in her world. So, yeah, I think that blaze of red hair against the green of the forest was a big one for me as well.
Beautiful images throughout, all the way through, and I love the idea of like that color red popping up at various points in the narrative, like the fox and then the hair. And I need to stop asking questions and let you all have a go. So do we have any questions? Is there anyone in the audience who'd like to kick us off? Or Mohammed, do you have one from our online?
I have a couple online in case people need a moment to warm up. So this one is from Eileen. Were your own understandings of gender and violence and social constructs changed in the writing process? Sounds like such an incredible world building.
Oh, that's so interesting. Thank you. Should we repeat the questions so people can hear on the recording?
Sure. So it was your own concepts of gendered violence and social constructs changed as you wrote? Would that be a good summary?
Perfect.
Awesome.
Yeah, I think to an extent. I think, like I say, I was, particularly when I was going back and editing, I was trying to introduce more kind of nuance and specificity into the sort of gendered relationships between the men and women, particularly in Maya's past, and we see different forms of masculinity explored, like with her father, who's not a violent man but is a very sad man, and then we have men who are violent. We have men perhaps not naturally inclined to violence, but whose fathers are violent. We have characters who perhaps have that inclination to violence but choose not to be. So I definitely think I explored a lot more of those sides of masculinity and kind of got deeper into it through writing the book. And yeah, the question of gender, certainly, I feel like daughter was just a character that allowed me to be so sort of expansive with that, and it was just really, really interesting to be able to be in touch with a character that felt like how I felt before I sort of understood what that difference was, and what those dynamics of gender were, but to bring that understanding into a character who is actually much older, and yet who has never encountered those dynamics before.
That's a fantastic question, Eileen. Thank you so much. Do we have any other? Was there one more question from online?
Yeah, unless there is anyone in the audience who wants to have a go. Right.
Yourself at the front. We'll come to yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, I found that tricky to navigate as well, but I think it the way it's ended up has been that the way that the mother has constructed this world is so informed by her experiences of those gendered dynamics and her experiences of gendered violence, but by sort of creating a different narrative of how that sort of functions in this world, by creating that as a monstrous threat. It's almost like on a linguistic level, gender doesn't exist anymore, and then on the level of the daughter's understanding, because she doesn't have that sort of other against which to understand herself, all she knows is that the other is a threat. So when the man enters, she experiences him as threatening, but in the way that she would experience anyone as threatening. So it's like that. Yeah, that dynamic of like man, woman perhaps has instead become purely a case of like what is safe and what is not, but not the gendered terms of that have been stripped away almost. But I think it's interesting when the ways that I was really sort of getting into that were when the daughter actually meets this male character, and she does experience him as a threat, but she's also really curious about him, and she doesn't have any of the preconceptions that her mother has. So the ways in which the mother experiences this presence as a threat are incredibly gendered and are completely to do with her experience of gendered violence. Whereas when the daughter encounters this threat, it's what her mother has told her, but she also has she forms her own understanding of this person that isn't informed by a gendered experience, I suppose. Thank you for that question. Yeah, I found that hard to wrangle while writing it.
That's such an insightful question. Thank you so much. Do we have any other questions from the audience here? Yourself there?
Yes. Well, it's sort of a metaphor. I suppose there was a different title, but it was always mothy. There was always moths in the title. This one, I suppose, the life cycle aspect felt like it was in conversation with their lives and the cyclicality of their lives, but also in touch with sort of cycles of violence or cycles of those sort of gender dynamics that inform societal views. And I mean, at the other end of things, it's a convenient metaphor for like coming of age and emerging. So the book is structured in conversation with the title. The book is structured in 3 parts with we start with larvae and pupae and then imago. So larvae and pupae, I already knew what those were. We know and love larvae and pupae. I wasn't really aware that the term imago was what is the term to describe the emergent moth. But imago is also, and I only found this out really recently, and this is so fascinating to me, imago is a psychoanalytic term in Jungian psychology that describes an idealized image of a parent. And yeah, it's so perfect.
You need
I
to
was
tell
like
people that was on
punching the air.
purpose.
Yeah, I know. I should tell people it's on, but it's almost more exciting to me that that wasn't on purpose. So I feel like I have to say, because it's I mean that's obviously so in touch with the kind of way that the daughter sees her mother.
And Moth is also, it's sort of like there's something that's sort of thought of as unpretty or a nuisance,
Yes.
but actually their wings and the details and patterns on them are beautiful.
Yeah.
That's another fantastic question. Thank you so much. Shall we go to the other question from online there?
So this is from Jude. Who would you cast as the three main characters in a TV show? Or,
I love this
I know
question.
some people hate the TV question, are there other literary daughters/girls that you imagine she would have made friends with?
Oh. Yes, please.
So the question from Jude was, who would you cast in a TV show or film version of this? And what was the second part, sorry?
Or are there other literary daughters/girls that you imagine she would have made friends with?
Oh, are there other
Oh,
literary
cool.
daughters or girls that you think she would have made friends with?
Those are both amazing questions.
They are.
The second one makes me forget everything I've ever read, which these questions always do. I mean, I think of things like, has anyone read Bastard Out of North Carolina by Dorothy Allison? I feel like she'd be friends with Bone, and she actually gives herself the name Bone at one point. I also think she would be friends with not a daughter, but a son from Kerry Hume's The Bone People. I think she'd be friends with the mute boy in The Bone People. The TV question I love this question so much, and I've thought a lot about it. I mean, really, I want it to be a play, but I'm not going to stop someone making it into another visual commodity that we can all watch. I think daughter would have to be an unknown. I can't think of anyone who I think she'd have to be sort of street cast. But I think that the mother would maybe be somebody. I mean, I always thought Tilda Swinton, but I think actually she'd have to be younger, which is sad, because I think the mother in this is like in her 40s. I mean, Tilda Swinton could play 40s, so
She can play anything.
yeah, she can do anything. Someone like Tilda Swinton. Who else did I think of? I think Rebecca Hall is great. She's really good at doing like terrifying horror style stuff as well. Charlotte Gainsbourg
Ooh,
is
yes.
another one. I've thought a lot about this. I've got a whole list. And Wynne could always only ever be and has only ever been Domhnall Gleeson, but a really haggard Domhnall Gleeson, like Domhnall Gleeson who has been through the ringer and has not shaved or cut his hair in like years, and probably hasn't eaten a good meal or had a wash in a while.
Need to rough them up a bit.
Yeah.
Yeah. I can see it. Yeah. West End stage.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think we have time for one more question, if anyone has a last question they would like to ask. Yourself? Yeah. You can.
Yeah, please. I think it was sort of oh yeah, sorry, yeah. For the online people.
So your question was it difficult to use language in a specific way, like avoiding pronouns and writing in the very direct way that daughter communicates? Is that right?
Yeah, I think it was in a large part kind of instinctive, like with her dropping the personal pronoun. Like, that doesn't happen all the time, so I wasn't like trying to completely avoid it. So it still sort of functions as a text in that way. It's not like she I didn't make that a rule for myself per se. It's more just like a sort of idiosyncrasy that she has, is that it doesn't often appear in her, or it maybe just appears a bit less in her lexicon. I think when it was about constructing, her voice, I suppose, there was definitely a point where I was really just thinking about like what her frame of reference would be, and her frame of reference is limited to this environment, so she wouldn't. I mean, if I use a metaphor, I can't say something like still as a statue because she doesn't know what a statue is, and that's such a boring metaphor, so she wouldn't say that anyway. She would say like still as a dead rabbit. And so it was figuring out like what the limits of her vocabulary would be, but then also what other ways of phrasing or wording might she have developed in response to like the gaps in what her mother has told her. So I think she also just, I mean, the language was really constructed around her like physical being as well. So her body is everywhere in her language, and she doesn't always necessarily use grammar correctly. She language to her is sort of like a physical thing that she can mess with a bit. So I think once I understood the ways in which she sort of interacted with language on the bodily level, it came much more easily. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a wonderful question as well. And thank you so much for coming along tonight in this beautiful garden and being such an amazing audience. We have Rowe, who's going to be signing her books over here, if you would like to come over and have them signed as well. But could you join me just one last time in thanking Rowe Irvin?
Thank you so much.